Welcome to the third conference of our series on the G8 and the G20 organized by the French Embassy. And it's a privilege for me, to be your host tonight. After global governance and the international monetary system, tonight we'll be addressing Internet and its governance. Internet has become something of a spinal cord, a vital infrastructure for the economy, for daily life, for social relationships, for everything. And like a spinal cord, it's often invisible. Few people know how Internet's governance actually functions. Internet entails all sorts of difficult questions, like how to reconcile freedom of expression with security, privacy, property rights. But global political leaders never really discuss it, as if it were something operated from outside, from an inaccessible underground location. If the G20 has never discussed the Internet, the G8 has discussed some aspects related to cybersecurity and to development. But for the first time at the Deauville Summit on May 26th and 27th at our initiative, G8 heads of state and governments will address the full spectrum and issue, we hope, Mr. Chair, a statement which is going to be a very bold one. I'm sure that the French presidency, like on any other issue, will take very strong initiatives. And it's a very new and positive development. So that's a few words I wanted to say at the opening of this conference. And I will now leave you in the very able hands of Ludwig Siegele from The Economist. We'll tell you why those difficult questions have rarely reached international politics, and how we can try collectively to solve them. Thank you, Ludwig, for having accepted to moderate this conference tonight. We are very grateful. And let me also thank the distinguished speakers. First of all, the French and British G8 Sherpas for Internet, Jean-Michel Hubert, that I've been knowing for 20 years, I guess now. Nigel Hickson, pleasure receiving you, as well as Richard Allen from Facebook, Bertrand de la Chapelle, an old friend of mine as well, from ICANN, Gilles Lordet from Reporters Sans Frontières, and Dr. Ian Brown from Oxford. And I want as well to extend my heartfelt thanks to our partners in this cycle of conferences on the G8 and the G20. Of course, the Institut Français, where we are right now, which hosts this event, the Financial Times, the London School of Economics, Chatham House, and the Franco-British Council. We have worked a lot together to create this conference cycle, and I pay tribute once again to my predecessor and friend, Maurice Gourdeau-Montagne, for having launched this initiative. And as you know, there will be another 3 events after tonight. The next one will address a very sensitive issue for the French presidency of the G20, commodity price volatility. It will be on the 1st of June, also in these beautiful premises of the Institut. Then we'll be addressing the African and development questions in late June at the London School of Economics. And then we'll be having a final conference on climate change with Lionel Barber and Nord Stern on October the 11th. Of course, you are invited to attend all these conferences. And to conclude, I have to say a word, to thank our general sponsors, without which nothing would be possible. Eurostar first, and I hope that you did travel comfortably from Paris. Mouette NC UK, I guess that it will be for after the conference. La Durée and La Cave à Fromage, which are very important partners. The outstanding combination of rail fare, bubbles, macaron, and cheese has been key to make this event possible and to make it, of course, as French as possible, bien entendu. On this note, full of hope for after the conversation, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, I wish you a very productive discussion and a very enjoyable and successful evening. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, de m'avoir invité. And I'm going to continue in English. I have the honor to chair this debate. When I was asked to do this, I actually thought it's going to be fun because I've been covering the internet since '95 or early '90s until now for the internet, for the Economist, not for the internet, on and off. And when I first started covering the internet, it was still kind of this network nobody knew for academics and in California mostly. And a couple of weeks ago I visited China and I did research for a big story on the Chinese internet, and there's now 450 million Chinese internet users, and soon there's going to be 700 million, and that kind of gives you the scope of what we're talking about today. Internet governance, I think De Gaulle would say vaste programme. So the internet has become so big, and of course then you have all these issues. How do you govern it? How do you protect it? How do you police it? And all of that. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to stop here and give the word to Jean-Michel Hubert, who's going to tell us about kind of what the French government is doing with the G8 and internet governance.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. I'm quite happy to be here tonight among you, and I wish to give you some information and explanation about what will be the internet in the G8 and what we have done during the last week and months since about last November. It was decided that internet will be a chapter of the G8, not G20, because questions of agenda of the two summits, but in the G8. May I say that this proposal of the French presidency was not at the beginning neither obvious nor natural, and some persuasion was needed to convince colleagues and members of G8 that it would be a good subject for an exchange between the leaders. Actually, it is not exactly the first time that the word internet is mentioned during G8 summit, and in Okinawa in 2000, some questions about specifically security on internet were discussed. But we can say that it is the first time this year, 2011, and in Deauville, that the G8 will embrace the subject and that the word internet will be analyzed in all its implications, issues, and goals. As it was mentioned by the ambassador, the summit itself is on 26th and 27th of May, but you may know that on the 24th and 25th of May, there will be another event distinct of the summit, which we call the EG8 Forum, different, but in a sense linked, as I will explain, to the summit itself. The summit was prepared by traditionally a team of sherpas and their assistants, and on this occasion was created a specific group called Internet Working Group. And I had the pleasure to work in this group with my friend Nigel Hickson, who was representing United Kingdom and France for me. The summit itself will produce a communiqué, as usual, and will also include what we call a private session, private discussion between the leaders. Of course, you can't wait from me that I read you the communiqué today. But I may tell you that it is on a very good way about its preparation. And just a few elements, perhaps, are still under discussion at this time. When we began to work in January in our group and with Nigel Hickson, we said very rapidly that this communiqué should be a high-level expression, that it should emphasis on the international dimension. It means at the same time the necessity of cooperation between the member states, and the fact that the G8 is not closed on itself, but this message should be read and heard by the whole world, and that it could be based on principles and not specifically on technologies. So you will find probably in the communiqué words as growth, major impact of internet, recall of fundamental rights, and importance of freedom of expression. And probably the discussion between leaders and the communiqué might mention the different chapters that we worked about: security, privacy, and protection of personal or commercial data, protection of intellectual property, which is a very sensitive issue, development, I mean cooperation with developing countries. And as you may know, just after the G8 in Deauville, there will be another meeting the day after between the G8 itself and another G8, 8 countries coming from Africa. So it is important that the summit in itself gives a message to developing countries. And another chapter about governance, which was mentioned right now. Something important. The G8 as a first discussion between leaders in this way should not be understood as a negotiation, but as an exchange. And it is an exchange to find a better collective and mutual comprehension of what is happening in the world with internet. The G8 also shouldn't be, or will not be, a substitute to the numerous institutions and fora that around the world regularly deal with internet. And on the other hand, it will support these places and events where important work is done regularly and where all stakeholders can meet. I mean the private sector, the civil society, and the governments. And I could mention the Internet Group Forum, which was created at the WICIS in Tunis in 2005, ICANN, OCDE, Security Group, and events as precisely a conference which was recently announced and proposed by a British minister to be held in London before the end of the year, but I think that Nigel will speak more than me about this. There will be also, as I mentioned, a private session. Elements for this session are under preparation. And in this private session, there will be an input for the leaders coming from the forum. And I do the link at this time between the summit and the forum itself. Input for the forum, and probably a specific discussion about security, different questions dealing with security, cyber criminality, cyber terrorism, protection of youth. Why the forum? It is just an analysis that what's happening in the world is developed by producers in direct connection with consumers. That's the market. Can we say that consumers more or less are part of civil society and producers of the private sector? But leaders wanted to express the fact that they feel how important is the role of civil society and private sector conducting a large part of the movement of development of Internet. And it was felt as a necessity to give these partners a possibility to express their practices, their vision of the future, and, if they wish, message to the leaders. I said that the G8 itself is not a negotiation but an exchange between the leaders. And in the same approach, between the forum and the summit, it will not be a negotiation. It will be an expression of the vision of the future, which can be useful for the leaders to understand what is happening and what is their responsibility of states and governments in their partnership to these movements. It is possible that during the forum, some subjects as net neutrality, cloud computing, taxation, regulation, financing research and infrastructures, sharing the value, all these subjects will be debated. There may be more or less technical subjects, and the leaders will not discuss specifically about these questions. But it is important to understand, between the words cloud computing or net neutrality, what are the impacts? What are the economic impacts? What are the social impacts? What are the juridic impacts, which may call a presence and a line or a decision sometimes from the governments. And we feel that it may happen that the partners themselves, the stakeholders, call from the government for some expression. For instance, to give a better visibility to the markets in which they are operating. Visibility for the market, harmonization of international rules. It can take the words of common rules, of codes of conduct. Probably, from the forum, there will be no unanimity, but it is not the most important. What is important is what are the ideas which are presently discussed and what do they represent as visions for the future. So this is what I wanted to express to you as a first presentation of this forum. May I just conclude saying that during these 4 months we elaborated, I could say, all the partners in this movement and all the countries of the G8, a real consensus about, first, the importance of the question for economies, for societies, for freedom of expression, for culture and creation. Consensus also for the appropriate attention and policies from governments which are necessary. Internet expands in the societies and in the markets that we know from our past. And in these societies and markets, there are existing rights, principles, rules, laws, freedoms. And Internet has to develop considering these basic elements. International dimension, I expressed already that, which means trans-border answers to questions that may happen, convergent policies and collective actions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, Mr. Ambassador, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour to be here tonight. I hadn't been here before, which is my loss. It's a great place to have a discussion of this nature in such a historic building. And looking around with all these books, I was trying to sort of say some sort of humorous link between the internet and books, but it just leaves me. So I won't bother. But I think it is extremely appropriate that we discuss these issues tonight. It's a great honour for me to be a digital Sherpa. As such, I certainly wouldn't have known what that meant sort of 6 or 9 months ago. I'm not quite sure I know now, but it is indeed a pleasure to be one. And I would like to, in case I forget later on, I would like to tell the audience tonight and the panel here what an excellent chairman Jean-Michel has been. And I'm not just saying that because he's sitting on the same platform here, but he is right, I think, to reflect on the genesis of this issue of the internet in terms of the G8. It's not a natural fit. It's not natural for G8 leaders, I think, to get round the table and discuss something like the internet. And I think what is clear to me that if we had have suggested this sort of broad developing discussion perhaps 10 years ago, then I don't think we would have succeeded. And I think that's true because, as Jean-Michel said, there was some reluctance, even now in this era of the internet, if you like, to discuss these things. G8 leaders have precious little time on international developmental issues, on political issues, on security issues at the G8 summits, and to devote time to discussing the internet. And not just discussing the internet as such, but also hearing from business leaders on their concerns, on their issues, on their perspectives for the future of the internet, I think is very brave and very commendable of the French government to put this on the agenda, and indeed a bold step, which I'm sure will bear fruit. So my initial remarks tonight, and I'll come back to address some of the questions later, perhaps, is on why the UK think that it's an appropriate and important time to discuss the internet. It's probably very easy to say it's a critical time for the internet. We can all say that. But I think that as we go into this new decade, we are seeing that the internet is playing an ever more increasingly important role in all of our lives. And this isn't just something to do with e-commerce, it's not just something to do with e-business, it's not just something to do with entertainment or the economy. It's become a sort of social event in itself, a social issue, part of our everyday culture, something that we discuss at every international issue, something we debate, something that we come to conclusions on. And as we look at this G8 discussion that's going to take place in Deauville in a few weeks' time, I think we have to reflect that this is a time of opportunities, but also of threats. Again, perhaps easy to say we always face opportunities and threats, but surely at this time, and this probably wasn't on the minds of the French presidency when they put this issue on the agenda, but now, more than anything else, with developments in North Africa and other parts of the world that have taken place in the last few months, we can see the importance of this debate. The threats we face through cybercrime. Every day we read stories in our paper of the attacks that happen in private institutions, in public institutions, and the damage and the sheer loss to the economy, to the citizen, to the private institutions through cybercrime. All too often we think of cybercrime and then we move on. But it's real. Real in the sense that it's a threat and it's a wasted resource. It's a waste of critical resources in terms of fighting it and in terms of the monies that are appropriated by terrorists and criminals. Data theft, data privacy, an issue again on the G8 agenda, on the internet, paper, data privacy, the importance of personal data, and the damage that compromise of personal data does. Intellectual property theft, something again which we address. And another threat, which I think is interesting to some of us that have been dealing with the internet for years, is the internet as a tool of oppression. Now, I'm not saying that I invented that term at all, but only a few years ago, when we talked about the internet, we only talked about it as a tool for democracy, as a tool for freedom, as a way of spreading democratization across the globe. And I'm not saying that that's not true, but the G8, but the internet also is used in an opposite way, as we've seen in various countries in recent times. But of course, let's not dwell on just the threats. The opportunities are enormous. The importance in the change of our lives, the economic growth, the productivity gain through using ICTs, and of course, as I said, the fact that it does have such an important role in spreading democracy and spreading news. Every day we read about the effect of the internet in one light or another, and I suppose I must, given that this is sponsored by FT, and they said, would you hold up a paper and say that, and I think it will be difficult to read the FT on any day of the week and not find the internet in it. I think actually on the day of the royal wedding, they didn't have much on the internet. But most days they have something. And of course, today was this interesting story. Well, I suppose it's interesting about Twitter. So I read Twitter user account lays down challenge to super injunctions. So I wanted to read on about these super injunctions. I wanted to know who these politicians and footballers and chefs were. But at least we know it's now footballers, chefs and politicians, and it's not anyone, it's not civil servants, so we're okay. But clearly the internet is getting into all of our lives, and that's why it's important for the G8 to address it. And in the communique that our leaders will sign up to, and something that we as the digital Sherpas have been working on, the communique will reflect all these different issues, as Jean-Michel has said. It will be a bold communique. It will be something that the G8 leaders, I hope, will be proud of. But of course, as Jean-Michel also said, the G8 is only the G8. It's only 8 countries that, if you like, are chosen in some way or some understanding to be able to communicate on these issues. And what's more important is the outreach and the effect which statements of this might happen and the follow-up in other international organizations. And so just 2 concluding remarks from me. First of all, that I think our discussion at the G8, our discussion tonight, our discussion elsewhere, and essentially at the EG8 forum, which again is a very bold step of the French presidency, will clearly demonstrate, if it needs to demonstrate, that internet issues have to be addressed in a multi-stakeholder environment. We cannot, just as governments, address these problems and come up with the right answer. We cannot, just as businesses or academics or social society. We need to meet together in these fora to really thrash out these issues. And my second remark is picking up the kind invitation that Jean-Michel gave me, and that is to note that William Hague, our Foreign Secretary, in a very brave speech, and I'm not saying that because I'm a civil servant in the government, but I think anyone would say in a very brave speech at the Munich Security Conference, faced the challenges of cyberspace head-on, looked at what it means to society, said that we are in a changing environment, that we do need to address particularly the threats of cybersecurity, and challenged his audience. And he will challenge further a much wider audience at a conference that we're holding, or a summit that we're holding in November in London for many, many different member states, to challenge that audience, the wider global community, about the threats that are faced by cybersecurity, the behaviors that we should have on the internet, whether we should have norms of behaviors, whether we should be able to have global standards in the way that we behave ourselves on the internet. And no doubt we'll hear much more about that as we go forward tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. So we've heard from the governments, from the G8 here, and now we're going to turn to an organization which, as far as I can remember, was actually founded as in opposition somewhat to governments. And so, I mean, that's no longer really true, and you're kind of the personification of that. But yeah, give us your view on internet governments as far as ICANN is concerned, and perhaps tell us to what extent you think that the G8 or governments in general can kind of play a role in internet governance.
Thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this meeting. It's a great pleasure. As has been mentioned, my name is Bertrand La Chapelle, and I'm a member of the board of directors of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And I had the privilege before to be actually the successor of Jean-Michel Hubert at the French Foreign Affairs Ministry as thematic ambassador for the Information Society. And following as such the issues that emerged from the World Summit on the Information Society. From the position I am now within ICANN, I think I will piggyback mostly on what Nigel has said regarding the importance of the multi-stakeholder interaction and the cooperation, dialogue, and convergence of interests of government, civil society, and the private sector. ICANN, as was mentioned, was not created against government, but to establish something that was not an intergovernmental entity, which is slightly different. The purpose of ICANN is a relatively small mandate, but on a very critical set of resources, i.e. the domain name system of the internet. So it's, in many ways, a relatively obscure exercise, but a very important one in terms of ensuring that all the actors cooperate to make this run correctly. It's interesting in the respect that it is an issue-based institution with a very narrow mandate and with something that is not really dealing with some of the issues that we're talking about in terms of substance. I mean, ICANN has no real direct mandate or responsibility regarding freedom of expression, privacy, and so on, even if, of course, it is impacted by many of those issues. So the angle I would like to take here today is more on the process angle. And in particular, the problem we're facing, I was giving a conference yesterday at the International Diplomatic Academy, where I also conduct a program in Paris. And the originality of the issues that we are dealing with, the policy issues related to the internet, are not actually very new. They just have changed in nature and in complexity. And in complex dynamic system science, there is a word that says more is different. Privacy, freedom of expression, taxation, and all those issues, intellectual property rights, cybercrime, they exist in the real life. They take a different nature because of the speed, because of cross-border interaction, and because of one thing that people rarely mention, which is the non-linearity of effects. What I mean by non-linearity of effects is that when a pastor in a small town in Florida launches, let's say, a misguided idea about a burn a Koran day, it immediately has an impact not only on other countries, but it triggers riots and deaths in Pakistan. The speed at which this happens, the management of hate speech, the management of freedom of expression, the management of the responsibility of the actors, including governments, on the impact they can have on other actors, is a major issue. And to do this, there has been a strong recognition by the World Summit on the Information Society, where Jean-Michel Hubert and Nigel were the representative of the France and the UK. I was participating in the World Summit on the Information Society, but more on the civil society side. The recognition of the World Summit on the Information Society was through the definition of internet governance that was produced in 2005 in Tunis, was the fact that the development of policy needs the articulation and the cooperation of government, civil society, the private sector, and international organizations in their respective roles to the elaboration and implementation of regimes. What the expression in their respective roles really entails is the matter of not only discussion, but regular update and refinement. What I want to say today is that out of the WSIS and with ICANN, we have now 2 laboratories with the Internet Governance Forum and ICANN for multi-stakeholder policy making. These 2 initiatives, ICANN dates back to 1998, and the IGF was produced by the World Summit on the Information Society in 2005. These are relatively recent experiments, and there is a lot to be perfected. However, in the last 5 years, in any case, since the end of the World Summit, I think the experience has demonstrated the benefit of getting people in the same room to address the issues and to basically paint the picture together so that all the dimensions of an issue are being addressed. In this respect, IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, is mostly about decision shaping. It's a dialogue, it's an open space, not making decisions. And on the other hand, ICANN has the capacity to make decisions, but has also a multi-stakeholder process. And so the fact that the G8 is now addressing the issues related to policy on the internet is bringing the political visibility to a higher level, and this is good. It is also good that this takes place in an environment where several initiatives are flourishing. You know that the OECD is developing things. The Council of Europe is participating on establishing principles regarding cross-border internet traffic. Many other entities are developing principles, rules, potential regimes. And the G8 is giving a strong impetus in that respect, and the articulation of this process with the others is going to be extremely important. But what I want to highlight in conclusion here is that ICANN will participate in the G8 forum. The chairman of the board, Peter Danget-Trush from Australia, Rod Beckstrom, the CEO, myself as board member will be in the G8. And the purpose and the benefit will be for us to testify in a certain way of the merits and the benefit of the multi-stakeholder interaction. I hope, as I think it is going to be the case, that the G8 will send a positive message in favor of multi-stakeholder governance. I hope there will be a message as well to support the process that is the Internet Governance Forum, because it is a very important process and a very important laboratory, and also ICANN. Because in a nutshell, Nigel was talking about threats. I think the challenge we have today is to find the rules and the modes of coexistence of basically 2 billion people plus who do not necessarily share the same political, cultural, religious, and other values, and who are now sharing a common space. And there's no other way to develop this. Interestingly enough, the G8 can set an example in this respect, and it's great that the E-Forum is bringing other actors. I remember that my first connection with the multi-stakeholder approach was actually due to the G8, because back in 2000, the G8 established the Digital Opportunities Task Force, which was a pioneering experiment setting up a group of people from business, from civil society, and from governments who were addressing at the time the digital divide as a topic. And this is where I personally got convinced about the benefit of this approach. And in the last 11 years now, I've only seen that grow. The final point is, I will be very interested to see how the G8 Forum addresses the challenge that we are all facing in those processes, which is how do you synthesize the very good dialogue that goes among 600 or 700 people? Who does the synthesis, and how do you pick the people who will be reporting. It is a very complex challenge, and let's be honest, nobody has the perfect answer to that. It's a very, very tricky one, and I'm very glad that you will have to cope with this. Thank you.
We're now going to turn to Ian Brown. He is kind of the representative of the scientific perspective on the issues here, and your research focus on the privacy and copyright. So what can be the role of the G8 in these areas?
Well, what I'm going to talk about, but I'm happy to come back to privacy and copyright later. I co-authored a study last year for the OECD on systemic global cybersecurity risk. The OECD is running a project called Future Global Shock, where they are looking at a number of case studies of things like global pandemics, further collapse of the global financial system, and their third case study was cybersecurity risk, which they asked me and my co-author Peter Summer at the London School of Economics to assess. They published our report earlier this year, and you can find it on their website. I can only give you a very brief summary of it now, and then talk a little bit about what the G8 and other intergovernmental organizations are doing in this area. Clearly, as several speakers have already said, the internet is now a critical information infrastructure, as the OECD puts it. So much of economic activity and social activity in the developed economies and increasingly the developing economies depend upon the internet and related technologies. Since 2000, in fact, in the OECD member states, over half of GDP was based on IT support. So this is not even a brand new thing, but there is ever-increasing social dependence. What we concluded at the same time as noting that dependence was that compared to global pandemics and further crashes of the global financial system, so far cybersecurity threats by and large are not in that league. So actually being more specific about some of the threats that get a lot of media coverage, what you might call cyber graffiti, people defacing websites, for example, of companies or government agencies for propaganda purposes, embarrassing for the companies, but doesn't go much further than that. Cyber fraud, there is poor data on the extent of that. There are many figures thrown around, but certainly the best data, I think, says that the problem of cyber fraud, the losses are probably within the low billions, certainly not trillions, and that they are containable within the financial system. The banks actually, by and large, are fully aware of the attention they need to pay to cybersecurity in their networks. Cyber terror, one of the experts at NATO that we interviewed told us that terrorists get better returns from much simpler methods such as car bombs. Cyber terror is too low-key, not enough dead bodies result, and attacks are too complex to plan and execute. Cyber war, moving up the scale somewhat. I'm sure you heard all about the happenings in Estonia and Georgia over the last couple of years, attacks on government systems there. At the same time, looking carefully at what happened, I'll just give you a couple of quotes from studies for the US, one study for the US Air Force actually, and one study, I think, for the US State Department, that the Korean cyber incidents, so those were more recent than the Georgian and Estonian incidents, were annoying and for some agencies embarrassing, but there was no violence or destruction. Cybercrime does not rise to the level of an act of war, even when there is state complicity, nor does espionage, which are the activities that currently dominate cyber conflict. And more specifically, clearly, the armed forces of the G8 member states are highly dependent on information systems. Clearly, it would be a catastrophe for those forces if those systems were compromised during operations, but at the same time, a RAND study for the US Air Force concluded, at best, cyber attacks can confuse and frustrate operators of military systems and then only temporarily. Thus, cyber war can only be a support function for other elements of warfare. And then finally, on this spectrum of threats, we looked at cyber espionage, which has received an enormous amount of media coverage in the last year after the WikiLeaks episodes. But that was not, of course, the first incidence of this. Over the last several years, there have been a number of well-publicized incursions into US, UK, Germany, and other countries' government agencies. We read in today's event that the French Foreign Ministry had recently had incursions. that those are looking to get traditional intelligence material from governments, but also on a military economic level, infiltrations into large defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, for example, by attacks originating in the territory of China. The Chinese government strongly denied it was anything to do with them. Those are the threats we said in the long term are probably most serious, actually, as a threat to the developed economies' technological superiority. Even there, however, we said so far that is not a threat that's on a global systemic scale alongside these other risks. So actually the message of our study was in some ways quite positive, that these threats are not nearly as severe in many cases as they are made out to be in the media, and that member states, that intergovernmental organizations and states do have some space through the kind of activities the G8 is proposing to take remedial action now to make sure that remains the case, that as society gets ever more dependent on these information infrastructures, that we do not start to see cybersecurity threats causing the same catastrophic outcomes as some of those other systemic threats. Having said all of that, let me just briefly talk about what intergovernmental organizations are doing. The OECD has been doing a lot for a number of years on this. The ITU has been doing a lot of valuable work on education and sharing best practice amongst the 191 member states of the United Nations, producing guides for developing countries on cybersecurity and cybercrime, toolkits for botnet mitigation, national critical information infrastructure protection, self-assessment tools. The G8 has been doing a lot of good work in this field for many years, actually. The G8 adopted in 1998 10 principles for protecting critical information infrastructures that proved very influential on later work by the OECD, by the UN, by other groups. Interpol has set up regional expert groups on information technology crime in Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America. NATO has established a cyber defense management authority. The Council of Europe provides ongoing assistance to countries that wish to accede to its cybercrime convention. The European Union has a network and information security agency. So you can see that a lot of IGOs are working in this field. That is perhaps one of the tricky things for the G8 to focus on, how they best coordinate that work across those multiplicity of organizations. Clearly, the broader global coverage you can get, the better. So I think certainly bringing in the G20 member states would be a positive thing. Persuading Russia to either ratify the Cybercrime Convention or to develop other mechanisms for joining these global efforts. Russia is, I think the Russian ambassador is here tonight, so he can tell us himself Russia's concerns about this convention. But just a quote for you I found from last year from Russia's Federal Financial Monitoring Service, that the Budapest Convention makes it possible for the law enforcement agencies of one country to have access to the resources located in another state's public domain network without notifying that state. This approach does not suit Russia. We need to, after all, consider our national security interests. So that is one of the sticking points, not just with Russia, with other nations as well. A lot of cybersecurity operational plans and procedures in some ways do start to move into those areas of national security, very direct interest of states, and I think persuading countries it is in their national interest to take part in these broader global efforts would be one very positive outcome the G8 might be able to achieve. Thank you.
Next up is Richard Allen. And Richard, you recently joined Facebook, which is another organization. I would even say it's almost a country. I mean, you have 500 million members. You have a currency. You have elections in a way, debates. No. From your perspective, I mean, what can the G8 do kind of to make your life easier?
I don't know about the last part. If that is the intention, that would be fantastic. But I would like to start by thanking you, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, and the other sponsors for this evening's event, and thank the G8 Sherpas for facing up to the mountain that is internet governance. This is certainly a very timely debate for us, and we are very intensely engaged with the G8 planning. In fact, my colleague Anne-Sophie Baudry, who's based in Paris and represents us there, is here tonight, and we're, as I say, very much engaged around what the EG8 and the G8 can mean for the internet sector, and hoping that it will, if not help us specifically, help map out a roadmap for the sector in general that would be helpful. And in my comments tonight, I wanted to really touch on two things. One is to talk about the experience of a particular company in trying to tackle some of these issues on the ground, and our experience both in terms of what we think it is we're delivering for society and in terms of the events that took place, the very now well-known events that took place in North Africa earlier on this year, and then to draw a few lessons out from that. In terms of what we think we're doing, our mission, as publicly stated, is very simple. We are developing a service which gives people the power to share with each other and to make the world more open and connected. That's a classic corporate slogan, but I think in a way it sums up what internet communication services are trying to do. We create services that let people make connections with each other, and then we don't determine what they do with those connections. What they do with those connections really is down to their innovation, in the same way that the infrastructure that supports the connections is a result of our innovation. And we think that we have seen positive benefits for businesses, for schools, for civil society, for families, indeed for politicians, as they've been able to use these new platforms to express and connect themselves with people who are interested in what they have to offer. And I think if our experience has taught us one thing, it's that no single entity will be able to determine whether or not we can realize the full power of the technology that we and the other internet companies are developing for connecting people. Instead, the future of technology will be determined by the combined efforts of service providers like ours, but absolutely crucially by the efforts of governments and the rules that governments, such as those represented in the G8, the G20, and other international fora set, and by civil society, who have actually a huge role to play in the internet space. It's really interesting to see how civil society has developed in a way to fill a void because traditional national jurisdictional bodies don't exist. Civil society has grown up tremendously in the internet space, and at things like the Internet Governance Forum, you see very strong evidence of that. And lastly, by the hundreds of millions of people who use the internet every day. And people on the internet, I mean, people talk about it as being almost a perfect market, and we can dispute how perfect it is, but it's certainly true that in the internet space, millions of people every day are making choices about the services they use and the way that they use them, and those choices are simpler and more rapidly made than I think in any environment we've seen previously, as Bertrand described. That speed is really significant. In terms of what we think we're doing in regard to freedom of expression, I think it is helpful to step back a moment and think about how internet access has developed. If we think about the first waves of information technology back in the 1960s and 1970s, these were very expensive, very exclusive. They were large, heavy machines and very expensive software platforms that were required to run them. And that essentially meant that only large organizations, traditional media outlets, had any form of voice using information technology. And then I think we saw through, in particular, subsequent technological waves, particularly through the 1990s, where we saw tools like blogging that led to an explosion of citizen journalism, that we had a much greater, through commercial, or rather through commercial offers of domestic internet services and through open source and other platforms, we saw this huge explosion of the ability of people to express themselves. But I think it was still really restricted to what you might call a technorati, people who had technical skills to set up and build these things themselves. And I think what we've seen since the year 2000, and particularly over the last 6 or 7 years with services like ours, not exclusively ours, there are many others in the same space, is this true democratization of speech on the internet, in that it is now reasonable to assert that, certainly for most parts of the world now, and increasingly we're porting our services to very cheap and easily accessible mobile platforms so that they're truly available globally, but certainly in most parts of the world, the ability to set a service up to express oneself requires very little technical expertise because we've made it so simple, actually requires very little cash because many of the services are free to use. And that is giving freedom of expression, I think, now to hundreds of millions of people who previously didn't have that. And the uses that they put these tools to are as varied as the individuals themselves. Most of their interactions are about daily lives with their family and friends, but it is used to express all kinds of views, including political views. I think it's worth remembering that most of that political expression, again, is not in exceptional times, but is actually part of the normal part of governance. So Barack Obama has, I think, now in excess of 20 million people, Facebook fans on his page. I know he competes with Lady Gaga, but I think Lady Gaga is now streets ahead and is past 30 million. But still, that's a significant number of people engaging politically. But then you can look at President Goodluck Jonathan in Nigeria, who has 500,000 fans. You can look at the candidates in the elections in Colombia, a country where traditional political activity was often met with intimidation and death. And you can see hundreds of thousands of people signing up for the campaigns of Juan Manuel Santos and Antanas Mockus in the last election. Mockus's Facebook page had more than 800,000 fans, many of whom were young voters. So we are seeing lots of different forms of political expression. Perhaps the most interesting example of that, though, and I think we do need to touch on that, has been the activities that took place in particular in Tunisia and Egypt over early months of this year. It's actually interesting sitting there at Facebook. I think my first alert around Tunisian activity was on Christmas Eve, and we started to call people in government and say there's something going on, and quite a lot of the reaction from government was, what's going on? Please tell us, because we haven't yet seen it. But we were seeing it, very rapidly because people were quickly organizing through the platforms. We then went through a series of well-documented and I think well-publicized episodes where people, and we still don't know who those people were, sought to compromise accounts on Facebook in Tunisia, and we took very strenuous measures to protect the integrity of our system and protect our users from that kind of compromise. And then we saw clearly in Egypt a decision by the government to turn the internet off, and it's really curious. There is a debate, I think a sort of more global debate around internet kill switches, and do governments have internet kill switches? I think actually from our perspective you could look at it as very much the notion of turning the internet off as being a suicide switch, because increasingly for your society, turning the internet off may deal with the activity which you as government think is bad activity, but it also gets rid of a whole raft of good activity. The economic activity of your country, increasingly your critical national services are internet dependent, and so turning the internet off is not very smart, I think, in pretty much any circumstance for any government to do. The Egyptians decided to do it, and then subsequently decided to flip it back on again. What we saw when that block was lifted was millions of people logging onto their accounts immediately, and then new registrations rising dramatically. There was, every time we've seen our service compromised or restricted, as soon as access is re-granted, then usage just takes off quite dramatically. I think it's clear to us that it's not our service that carries out the political activities. Those are activities by individual people who have a level of commitment to a political cause, and often a very high degree of bravery in expressing that commitment. Our job is simply to create platforms that people can use to express themselves for whatever is important within their lives. And our job is to try and maintain access to those platforms. So in closing, I would say, we're absolutely clear that the recent events that we've seen provide stunning evidence of the power of government to control access to communications should they wish to do so. In Tunisia, the government compromised the integrity of the systems. In Egypt, they turned it off altogether. We're absolutely clear that it's government, not private entities, that need to set a course for navigating the competing visions of public good, such as whether speech should be permitted when it threatens national security, the issues that Ian has described. In a sense, we're, as private entities, not able to make those judgments, those very tough judgments between national security and free expression and free association. But we think that undoubtedly companies and civil society organizations have a role to play in responding to those questions, but the tensions primarily fall on governments to resolve them. So we're realistic that our service can only flourish where governments are willing to allow it to flourish, and that's why we're extremely pleased that the debate is taking place today and at the EG8 and subsequently at the G8. I think it's a very interesting debate about the kinds of legislation and the kinds of self-restraint that government needs to show. I mean, governments everywhere will take to themselves powers to intervene on the internet for grounds of national security. They will have powers to intercept communications. They will have powers to limit communications. But the critical questions are the way in which they frame those questions, the way in which they put that legislation in place, and the way in which they exercise the powers they have. I think we would all benefit from a better understanding of these rules of engagement as we enter a time where internet access has the potential to be truly ubiquitous, which I think does change the game entirely. And that does require us to develop these mechanisms that allow the potential of the technologies to be realized in a predictable and secure way. So I do hope that in fact, I'm confident that the G8 under the French presidency will be another step along the way to developing those mechanisms and those rules of engagement. And would like to thank you again, Mr. Ambassador, and the sponsors for leadership on this issue and for your attention this evening.
Last but not least, we have Gilles Lordet, and he represents an organization I hold very dear because I once was on the board, Reporters Sans Frontières.
Good night.
Very important, and you're kind of the practitioner of all this. Kind of perhaps from your perspective, how has the internet changed kind of the work you're doing? Has it made it more difficult, easier?
First, I want to thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for inviting us and giving Reporters Borders the opportunity to give its point of view about the internet. This point of view is the point of view of an organization that defends freedom of expression, that perhaps it's a little bit different perspective from the other contributors tonight. And if I can convince the audience tonight of something, is that to defend the freedom of expression, democracy, the rule of law, of the independence of the justice, it's always the same fight because it's all values that are all going together. And when you fight for one, you fight for all of us, these values. And the world we are living right now is not a world where there is one internet for all. There is different kind of internet. You don't have access to the same information regarding to the fact that you are in China, in Iran, in Arabia Saudi, or in France, or in other parts of the world. We consider at Reporters at Borders that there is an average of 1 out of internet users that do not have access to unrestricted internet in the world. We think that there is an average of 60 countries that censor the internet in varying degrees. According to the data, there is 120 people who are in jail actually just for expressing the point of view on the internet because they have a blog, a site, or something like that. Very, very simple point of view about policy, about religion. And the biggest prison in the world on the internet are first China, with almost 80 people in jail for their activity on the net. After that, Vietnam, which is perhaps a little bit more surprising, is there is almost 20 people in jail actually. And there is Iran, when we have a lot of journalists, traditional journalists who escaped the country since 2009 and the re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but we have a lot of bloggers also who are fleeing the country and hiding from the authorities and who are in jail too. So we see what is very important for us is that the big part of access of information, which is very important things to be a citizen, to cast your vote, to have your opinion, to live in the rule of state, are now in the net. And some of these countries do not respect the freedom of expression and the possibility to have access to information. And it's not only a problem of access information in this authoritarian regime, it's also to have access to disinformation, because most of this regime do not only block the internet or do not only block access to information, but they endeavor to pass and to diffuse their own information. In Iran, you have a propaganda department with a bunch of hackers who are in the same time monitoring the activity on the net, but in the same time perhaps posting messages in favor of the government, in favor of the regime. In China, you have also a propaganda department that is regularly having meetings with journalists, with online journalists, in a way to learn then how to deal with the information, what kind of information you are allowed to deal with, what kind of information you are not allowed, what is the percentage of topics you can deal in your newspaper, online newspaper. So it's not only the blockage of information, but it's also the propaganda of some authoritarian regime or the point of view of the authority. About the blockage of information, actually, to give you an example, in China, if you type Jasmine in a search engine in China, you will not have any answer, because every word related to the Arab Rising are just censored. If you looking for the name Liu Xiaobo, which is the Nobel Prize last year, December 2010, you will not have any answer in the Chinese internet. So it's something rather important to consider. The system of censorship in China, which is called the electronic Great Firewall, is technically very, very effective. It works very well. To remind you that last year Google had a clash with the Chinese authority because it refused to censor its engine, research engine, and decided after that to move out from China and to be based in Hong Kong in order to have free access to his research engine from outside the territory of China. And this kind of practice that can use against dissidents, against bloggers, against online journalists can also be used against companies. It's something that already happened in some countries. You can check or spy exchange of email between two companies that want you to have a deal on a market, and because the importance of in the economy of the internet is not to prove anymore. But for example, when Egypt cut the internet for 5 days at the end of January, when there was the demonstration in the center of Cairo, it cost the economy of the national economy 19 million USD. So it was a very, very big impact. And for some experts, the two aspects to have in mind is that to block access to information and to censor the internet, in fact, it's a way to what we call disguised protectionism. In fact, it will be a way to discriminate foreign company and in the way to give the priority or to favor national companies. So just to quote Nelly Cross, which is the Euro High Commissioner for Digital Agenda and Competition, she was qualifying the censor at a trade barrier. So the mechanism against freedom of expression can be used against trade, and can be used against innovation also. Last year, there were a delegation of the US State Department with Cisco system and Microsoft, and they wanted to perhaps to export technology and to have new investment in Syria, and they met with the President al-Bashar. And in fact, they just stepped back because it was not possible because the market is too close. There is no possibility of development in Sharia because there is no freedom. It's impossible perhaps to Facebook, for example, to develop or to have extended activity because everything is under the monitoring of the authority. So it's a barrier to innovation, it's a barrier to creativity, it's a barrier, in fact, to trade, and it's a barrier to investment. When you don't have access to information, how can you calculate your return to investment? How can you have an idea of the level of corruption in a country? And how can you also fight against this corruption? So what I think for the point of view of our organization, what is important for us is that to always bring this subject of freedom of expression during the official meeting. There is some countries that are very vocal about the issue of freedom of expression. I will say, For example, the US Department last year was very vocal against Vietnam and against Azerbaijan. And it has an effect on Azerbaijan because two very important bloggers who are very well known in the country were released in October, and is directly related to the visit between President Barack Obama and the Azerbaijani president. We always push for that article related to good governance that are part of agreements signed between perhaps EU and another country, or perhaps two countries. This article of good governance must be respected, and we are pushing the democracy and the government perhaps to remind the countries that they have to respect this principle of good governance. To give you an example, Vietnam was included in the World Trade Organization in 2007. And a part of the condition of this inclusion in the WTO was democracy, respect of freedom of expression, which, by the way, are in the constitution of the Vietnam, but at the time being, is that absolutely not respected. And the role of an organization like Reporters Borders is to push international organization, instance, government, EU or others, really to remind the authorities that they are to abide by the agreement. So, for us, when we are talking about internet, it's a little bit a double face. There is a part of threat, we are talking about protection, we are talking about security, and we are talking about copyright. But what I want to perhaps to convince you is internet is also a kind of something crucial for the democracy. It is also an opportunity for the creativity and for trade, and the value of freedom of expression is something that it must be discussed at the same level as the problem perhaps of cyberterrorism, of security, and of protection of author. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for question and answers for the debate, and before I open up the floor, I will abuse my privilege as chairman and ask a couple of them of my own. And one question to the Sherpas first. I mean, listening to you, I still wasn't quite clear what the role of the G8 is supposed to be. I mean, is it just a debating club in this area? What do you really want to achieve in discussing the internet in this forum, and is this the best forum to do this? And then I want to pass on Bertrand's question is, so how, once you have this exchange, which is not a negotiation, how you can kind of synthesize it, sum it up, and kind of feed it perhaps other fora to come to kind of global decisions and setting of norms?
As we said, the next G8 is something new. It's a sort of experience. We can think that it can reach its goal if it is not a one-shot. There must be some follow-up of this G8. We can hope in the other G8s in the next years, but also in the events which will follow. G8 is a meeting between leaders, and for the first time they discuss about this subject, really. So, what can they say publicly from them, and even we can say to the rest of the world? And what have they to say between themselves? What is our comprehension and our responsibility in the movement? What is the role of governments in this, we agree, multi-stakeholder movement and approach? What the governments that leaders represent have to do and what they have not to do. It is a comprehension an expression of the roles of each stakeholder in the movement. So the G8 wishes to have a better comprehension of the importance of the movement. Should recall in what environment the system is evaluating. An environment which for years has been drawn by rules, laws, habits of the societies, of the markets. And Internet comes into this movement. And there are some principles of societies which have to be respected. And perhaps the leaders can recall this important question. Also from the summit can express support for other works which will be organized in different fora. And probably some events, some of them, perhaps some specific problems will be mentioned in the output of the summit itself. So I shouldn't say it's a beginning, but it is not a conclusion. It is a major event in the movement to express that everyone has a role to play, the governments, the markets, the private sector, the civil society, and we could say each citizen. How can you speak about security if you do not express to each internet user that he has a personal responsibility in what he does? And there are perhaps some principles to respect, so that it is a contribution, a personal contribution to the security of all. So all these elements will be the output of the summit.
Thanks. And Nigel, would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes, very much so. And I'm looking forward to questions from the audience. So I'll really pass. Only to say that I truly believe that the communique that comes out of the G8, will have some effect. It will be up to us as governments. It will be up to other governments. It will be up to organisations such as the OECD, the ITU, etc., to take some of those thoughts and perhaps try and, if you like, implant them in other fora, in other organisations. But I do think that the G8 leaders can make a difference.
The internet doesn't break with the exhaustion of IPv4 addresses, but its growth is very much stymied. And yet I've not yet heard anyone identify IPv6 adoption as a key topic for discussion at this G8 initiative. And I just wondered if you would share my enthusiasm that that's added to the agenda.
IPv6 obviously very, very important. I mean, as you rightly point out, 6UK, collaboration between the government and the private sector, another example of multi-stakeholder cooperation in a very important field. I won't pretend that it's an issue that we will address in detail at the G8, although others might have other views. But I'm sure it will be something that comes up at the EG8 forum, because clearly the address space is critical for the future deployment of the internet, not just the internet as we know it in terms of the personal internet, but of course the internet of things in the future.
I just fancy what would have been the attitude of some of our colleagues and boss if we say, well, leaders will discuss about IPv6. Already, may I say, when we prepared the situation about cloud computing or net neutrality, it was already difficult. But where is the link, perhaps between the forum and the summit, between your question and the summit? It's the fact that the leaders have not to understand what is IPv6. They have to understand that for the development of internet, for all the reasons that have been expressed tonight, growth, freedom of expression, access to everyone, and so on. Well, we need all over the world some infrastructures, on the broad sense of infrastructures, frequencies, networks, and numbering systems, and so on. And when something becomes critical, they have to know it, and they have to understand what is the consequence if a resource becomes too rare, because it can break or fragilize the system. That's the point they have to understand. Yeah? So perhaps that, well, the question will be raised in the forum, and we'll just explain, well, they need networks, they need addresses, they need resources. How can we develop the resources? And if the question is accepted, understood, well, it will be studied in the next events.
My question is very punctual, relates to data privacy. That was frequently cited tonight by many of you, and you recognize that that is an important issue in the discussions on internet. Could you please elaborate further as to how policymakers are addressing potential threats to this issue, data privacy? Thank you.
The most immediate actions of interest are the revision of the European Data Protection Directive, where the European Commission has proposed making some changes to the existing 95 directive. There were hearings in the US Senate today about mobile location privacy, and I think there will be certainly bills discussed in the US Congress, although whether they actually make any progress, given very strong opposition from certain industry sectors and parts of the US government to stronger privacy protection, I really don't know.
I think there's a very we're at a very interesting moment in privacy regulation, and just to be clear, internet companies are somewhere. They all exist from a particular jurisdiction, and they all have legal responsibilities. I think it's really important to understand that when you're building and developing an internet company, you don't do so in a regulatory void. The internet is regulated according to a set of jurisdictions depending on where companies are established. I think the problem we've had historically with the rhetoric is there's been a perception, if you like, that Europe and the United States are on divergent courses. And if people are developing internet services whose primary market is a combination of the North American and the European markets, that's a problem, trying to develop a single service to run across these multiple jurisdictions where the legislation is heading in wildly different directions. And why I say I think we're at an interesting moment is that there is now quite a lot of interesting talk going on, which I think may continue at the G8, around whether it's not time to call a truce and accept that the interests of both citizens and businesses in the United States and Europe is to have some common understanding of the basic principles of privacy protection, and then to encourage businesses to be good actors, to conform to those principles, and then once they've done so, for that to be sufficient for them then to trade across that block, and indeed a larger global block as well. But get those two sorted out, and we create a certain level of predictability, certainty, incentive for good behavior that means that internet services will develop, I say, both to the benefit of the users of those services and to the economies of people in both directions.
If I may make a comment on this that is more related to the interaction that I've witnessed in the Internet Governance Forum than the actual work within ICANN. As Richard was saying, the emergence of social media is bringing a new twist to the notion and the challenges of privacy protection. Most of the privacy regimes or the international legislations adopted at the national level or at a supranational level have mostly dealt with, at the time, with data that is collected from people by entities for various purposes. It can be, give me your information so that I give you this service, or you need to give me a credit card information to be registered and verified. Cookies and other types of things are information. Geolocation data is something that can be tracked which is fundamentally different from the problem that is emerging of data that people post themselves on social networks that are tremendously more important than what they used to do in the past. And so the challenge on social networks like Facebook is basically not only the typical collection of data and what the company does with it, but what other users of the platform can do with it. And I would refer to you to an extraordinarily interesting work that has been done by the Electronic Frontier Foundation in that respect, that is trying to identify a few principles regarding the transparency of the terms of service, regarding the rights that you grant to third parties to whom you give access to your data. What can they do with it? You may want your friends to be able to watch your pictures because they're your friends. But do you grant them the right to take them and then repost them somewhere else? That's a major change in the environment. And I would fully agree that there is a convergence that is emerging, hopefully between the US and the European Union in terms of the understanding of what those problems are. But pushing on the question that you were asking earlier, mentioning whether Facebook is a nation or so, the question becomes, is Facebook, for instance, a sort of territory? And could it be interesting to just take the problem in the reverse, instead of trying to harmonize just the national legislations that are applicable to a global platform? It can be Facebook, it can be YouTube, it can be another. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to try to design the terms of service and the framework for that kind of service in a collaborative manner, so that the terms of service of Facebook would become the unifying element for Facebook users? Because when you are on Facebook, or any other platform for that matter, you're certainly on a jurisdiction, but you're also on the servers. And with cloud computing, as OECD is exploring at the moment, there may be a trend towards principles for cloud computing that would be common for OECD countries, so that the major shifting of data could be done irrespective of borders. So considering social media as territories is an interesting topic that I actually study at the International Diplomatic Academy, and I'm very interested in connecting with anybody who's interested in the topic. Thank you.
I guess this is a question for the Sherpas. Why seems to be the next natural step to bring the topic to the G20? Why it hasn't been the case? Is there a political calculus? Do you fear a particular opposition by certain countries?
I think the reason is very simple. All these summits have an agenda, and they have different questions and problems to solve and to analyze. And I understand that leaders and their teams considered that the agenda of G20 was already very busy with questions that you know about financing regulation and so on, economic crisis and so on. So it was agreed that at the present time, G8 was a good place to begin. But of course, there are a number of countries present in the G20, not in the G8. And we know what the importance of their role. Some remarks have been made tonight, but there are also some contributions, sometimes more industrial contributions to the development of the movement. All this has to be taken into account. So we do not forget major countries in the G20. But it was a choice for practical reasons of agenda.
You talk about policies, regulation, rules, cyber attack. Do you take into consideration the capability of the user of his behavior? Does they really realize what they do when they use the net, when they use Facebook? I used Facebook in 2005 when I was an academic at UCLA because it was part of an environment to communicate between all the academics. When I see now my children playing with Facebook, it's not the same thing. The risks are not the same, and the evolution is not the same. So do people really understand the consequences of actually using social media? And that's, I would like to know if it's going to be part of a point in the G8, because I think to take the user is very important to consideration.
It's a topic, I guess, frankly, that we spend, most of the people in Facebook spend most of their time worrying about, thinking about, how do we design a service that is attractive and useful and safe and valuable to this very broad spectrum of people. And that broad spectrum of people actually is all age groups. Contrary to popular belief, the vast majority of our users are 18 plus, something like 87% are 18 plus and only 13% are under 18, but we need to design for both groups of people, and our user group crosses multiple cultures and languages. I mean, our starting point is that our users are pretty smart. I think it's an important piece. The second point is that most of those people, I mean, the vast majority of them, the vast majority of the time, are able to use our service and other comparable services without hitting major problems. So in a sense, the proof of the design is that the normal usage absolutely does meet people's requirements as being a safe and valuable service. At the same time, we're very conscious that we need to plan for and be able to cater for the exceptional cases. And I think what you'll have seen over the last few years, as well as a growth in the service, is a growth in our capability to do that. So you'll see things like now we have a really simple safety center, facebook.com/safety, has separate guide for teenagers, for parents, for educators, for law enforcement. That's all new in the last few months. You'll see we have a reporting system where if you want to report a problem, you can include your parent in the report so that they get to know that you've had an issue on the service. Again, new in the last few months. So we're under, I guess, constant scrutiny by a lot of people, constant interchange with non-governmental organizations, civil society again, who are very strong in this area, constant change with government and with law enforcement. And I think that it's not perfect, but the services are moving in the right direction. And we have to. If we don't get that right, individuals have problems, but so do we as a service provider.
Just very briefly to touch on your point about what's in the G8 communique. See me later and I'll tell you. But no, I mean, this is a very important point you've brought up, and it's not just in terms of privacy, it's also in terms of security as well. The responsibility, not just of governments, not just of business, but of the whole community that uses a certain service or a certain product. And that's something which the G8 group have talked about, have discussed, and we recognize that if we're going to solve any problems, then you have to address it in the whole of the value chain from one end to the other.
Internet seems to have solved the problem of cheap access to data, but you could argue that that's at the detriment of access to quality data. To illustrate why that might be important, a couple of years ago I sat down with a policymaker in a developing country discussing climate change, and he pulled out some internet research that he had done, about 50% of which was probably written by some blogger in a room, and he was basing his politics on this information. So it has real impact on people. He was somebody that had decision-making power. So there is, in my view, a question of governance related to the quality of data on internet. Would anybody care to take the opposing or confirming view? Thank you.
If you are talking about data, about information, the problem is that on internet there is everything. Why it's so large that in fact you can find very good bloggers, very bad bloggers, very good internet sites all over the world. But what I would say perhaps about the difference between the challenge for the journalism, because at the beginning Reporters Without Borders, it's an organization that defends the press and now extend to information, expression, and internet. But the challenge for the journalists is that there is a trend that is perhaps a little bit worrisome to see developing a good information, a real information for the rich, and a poor information for the poor. That good quality internet site or newspaper are are costly. You have to pay to have access to them. But it's very simple to Googleize the name and to have free information and free article. Usually just sum up of AFP or Reuters articles, which means really basic information about a topic. And there is also what we see, some not really information sites. They are very good, by the way, like Huffington Post or Slate, which are not really information sites, actually. They are more commentary sites. It's people who are commenting on the information. And the problem that pose that for the newspaper and for the journalists, there is less and less money to finance report, to send journalists abroad, to send them to Tunisia, to Libya, to Egypt. And at one point, there will be nothing to comment anymore when there will be no information and good information. So there is a big challenge for the newspaper. We know that the newspaper, at the time being, they have a challenge. It's an economic pattern, what we are doing. For 100 years, the newspaper have been based and financed by announcement, publicity, advertising. It's dead. They have to find another way. And they don't have the solution yet.
I'm going to ask the last question. It's going to be for Richard, because I have to ask you this. I think people were too polite to ask you. You said that your service will flourish in countries which let it flourish. Of course, there are rumors that you're going to enter China soon and you're going to do a deal with Baidu or Sina. I'm wondering, you probably can't answer that question, but how is kind of the thinking process? Where are you at? And the reason I'm asking this is when I was in China, I visited Sina Weibo, and Sina Weibo is kind of the Twitter service in China, and they have 600 people working only on reading tweets and filtering tweets. I mean, then don't you just do that, but that's kind of what you would have to do if you want to have a Chinese Facebook.
So you were right, I'm not going to answer your question. But I will try and give you something, which is to say there are, I think, two elements to this, two truths, which we're trying to reconcile. The first is we've built a service which we think is valuable to everybody. And therefore, we've been quite clear that the idea that people are excluded from accessing our services is something which we don't like. We would rather our service were available to everybody. Today, our service, the servers are sitting there and are accessible unless somebody puts a barrier in the way. And there are some governments that choose to put barriers in the way, but that's not a situation we like. So that's like the first truth about where we are. The second is the point that I made, and I will reinforce that point. You picked it up correctly, that, again, we're very clear. I was just trying to think of an analogy earlier. It is like a football field. You can have 22 players on the football field, so they appear to be the dominant force, but actually it's the guy in black with the whistle who really polices that environment. And governments are the referees of this internet football field. And so to try and do something that is totally contrary to that which they wish you to do is unrealistic. So is there a solution to that conundrum? You have a service you wish to make available, and yet you need to have awareness of and understand the rules that the referee is imposing. We don't yet know, and I think that's as far as I can say.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. That was very interesting. Thanks to the audience for the great questions, and yeah, let's do it again. Thank you.